Okay, I think we're live. Is it live on your end?
Yes, it is.
Okay, very good. So welcome everybody to the week 4 Hangout. And
Yes.
After fighting through a couple of technical difficulties, I think we're finally there.
Hopefully we don't have to go through that again.
Yeah, you and I have taught so much online, you'd think we had all this figured out, but sometimes even Google can surprise you.
Yeah, that was a brand new problem for me.
Well, good, everyone. So here's how Dr. Fever and I were thinking about approaching this call a little bit differently than other ones. We were hoping actually to focus this time on the midterm, as that's coming up in the very near future, and maybe talking just a little bit about some strategies, some ways to think about how to craft an effective lesson, and in particular around the context that we've given you, which is very challenging. And so maybe give some hints there. And then also, we'll talk just briefly about the forum posts and some of the topics there, which are actually really closely related insofar as they're both kind of pedagogical situations. So as a reminder, you can get all the info for the midterm under the resources section of the website. And what you'll find, two things there. First, you'll find something called the midterm instructions. And that's about a page or so. Let's see, I'm looking at it right now. Okay, it kind of spills over. It's about a page and a quarter. And it's going to give you the whole assignment in great detail. If you still have a question after that, feel free to answer it, or feel free to send it our way and we'll deal with it. And then the other thing you'll find on there is the midterm rubric. Now, I don't know how many of you are kind of familiar with the rubrics, but a rubric is a way of offering a really detailed description, usually in a chart format and in gradations of what we're expecting from an assignment. So just as an example, we will made up of, let's see, 4 parts. The first one is kind of required elements, and that's just, did you do the basics of what we asked you to do? Did you have all the sections, that kind of thing? To be honest, everybody should get like 100% on that section, which is 10 full points. That just means you read the instructions and you included all the stuff that we asked you to include. If you're missing things, or if there are parts that if the parts that you're missing that you didn't attend to, then you would lose points there. The second one is called writing style. So it's important for us that you're able to communicate clearly about your ideas. And so we will grade you on that, beginning with 10 and going down to 0. And then the second 2 are maybe the more, substantive ones, where we talk about teaching composition and sort of the way that you go about doing things. How do you integrate knowledge from the course? How do you use that knowledge in terms of your teaching? And so what Dr. Fever and I will do is we'll give you a score for each of those categories, and you will then be able to go back and look at the description and say, okay, as an example, this would be, this is coming from the teaching compositional history part of the rubric. It says a 10 would sound like this: the project demonstrates an exceptionally deep knowledge of issues related to the compositional history of the Bible, along with the ability to communicate this knowledge to non-specialists in clear and compelling ways. So that's like an amazing midterm. Okay, I don't know, we'll have to see how that works, Dr. Fever. I think I've given fewer than like 10 fit that category, So just to kind of gauge student expectations, that's when I grade, that I find somebody who's able to beat that. On sort of the opposite end, the 0 end, it would say the rubric says something like, the project demonstrates little to no knowledge of issues related to compositional history of the Bible and no ability to communicate this knowledge to non-specialists. Likewise, I give very few of those. Most people are somewhere in between, with the vast majority of being like 7s or 6s or 8s, something like that. Have you done much work with rubrics, Dr. Fever?
Yeah, quite a bit. I mean, I found that it's really helpful because it gives the students a really clear vision of a bigger picture of general expectations for the quality of the work. but then it also enables grading to be a lot less subjective. You know what we're looking for, and you can hold us accountable to that too. If we're not, it provides a point of dialogue over the grade. And so I think they can be. I think they're really helpful. I think that there's an error. You can err on the side of just following the rubric to a T, and then there's no. Sometimes I've noticed in some students there's no kind of for lack of a better word, there's no real personality to the work because you're just kind of checking off the boxes, and you don't want to do that either. You want to let the rubric give you a guideline, but then give the work your own personality within that guideline, for sure.
That's really, really good advice. Yeah, that's really good advice. And so I think you're right. It's about expectations, and then it's also about, it's not that we're asking you to kind of replicate the language of the rubric. The rubric's more about saying, these are, like you said, these are expectations. So I'd say tell me if you agree or disagree with this, I think it's actually worth reading rubrics really carefully and multiple times. And even what I found is it could even be helpful to find a study buddy or study person, or a friend who could read your paper against the rubrics.
Yeah.
Just if you want to kind of have a second set, I think that would be valuable.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
Yeah. Mandate that, of course, but just, as a suggestion.
Yeah, right.
The other thing I was going to say, and this has to do with like, how do you do this project really well? Pay close attention to the context. You probably noticed that we've given you a very particular and what I think would be a really challenging context. It says you are a leader in a multi-ethnic urban congregation in Detroit, and then we give you kind of a list of what those ethnicities and cultural identities are, and then we also talk a bit about some of the different subgroups within that community. And so I would say that as I've read these over the past few years, the best projects are the ones that are able to reflect on this fictional community and develop very specific strategies that are responsive to that community. So even now, it may be that the strategy ends up being totally wrong. That happens to me all the time, right? Like I give a lesson that just, I don't know, I read the audience wrong. But I think if you're doing it in a way, attempting at least to connect strategy with context, really powerful way, I think, of doing pedagogy. I don't know. What do you think about that, Dr. Fieber?
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. Bringing strategy and context together is, I think of the image of archery, shooting an arrow, and you can shoot an arrow at the wrong target. You can hit the target really well, but it could be the wrong target, and that's not what you want. So I think that's great. Context together, and I think in my experience that's sometimes that takes as much thought and thoughtfulness and work doing that as it does actually generating the content of the lesson or the study. Thinking about how you're going to communicate it to a certain context sometimes is just as much thinking.
Oh, I would certainly agree with that, and maybe even more so, I guess, depending on how long you've been in that community. Is that archery example from your time as a camp director?
No, not necessarily. Yeah, no, I've never even shot a bow and arrow before, so I don't know. I think I stole it from somebody else. I thought, hey, that works, but yeah, no.
Yeah. But jokes aside, I think that's right. So pay close attention to the context. Of course, we totally recognize, look, this is fictional, and you're going to have to reconstruct really construct some ideas about how this community functions. That's totally fine. We get that. I think I would just want to say, reflect deeply on the context. There are no effective lesson plans that are generic and that are not embedded within place and time and the people. And I think we see this, if we were to think about the Gospels and their kind of pedagogy, they're community documents, don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you said it really powerfully. I mean, there simply are no really effective lesson plans or proclamations, for that matter, sermons that are detached from specific context. I mean, I think that's really well said. And the Gospels are exactly that. Yeah. And Paul's letters, Paul's letters have such diversity that, you know, uh, each one is so tailored to community and context that it appears that Paul's saying one thing in one and another thing in another, and he very well may be. A lot of that might be because of context. He's very nimble in the way he communicates the gospel, who he's talking to, and what the issue is, and stuff like that.
Oh, that's a really good point. Well, and one place where you can really reflect deeply your ability to think about the context and then your what you want to get done is in the first section, which we call goals and outcomes. Now, here I'm not trying to say that like our syllabus is amazing, but you could take some examples from the syllabus for this course, not so much in terms of the content, I mean, maybe some of that's there, but in terms of how they're written. You'll often notice that we'll say stuff like, students will be able to do such and such a thing, or by the end of this course, students will believe or think or have a certain disposition toward whatever you're going to be teaching. And so the idea there is to place the focus on what you want your students to believe, think, feel, do, whatever those competencies are you're trying to develop. Try to think, as opposed to when I was an elementary ed teacher, most people kind of came into that program thinking that the way you did outcomes was to say, I will talk about, the Bible, or I will, do such and such a thing, as if the point was the teacher. But the point is not the teacher. The point is your students learning. And so in the outcomes, maybe consider making the students the agents of those verbs, saying, my students will be able to think, believe what. I mean, that's just my suggestion. Dr. Phoebe might have a different way of doing the outcomes.
No, I fully agree with that. I think that's in like Dr. Chan said, I think the best experiences and the best practices are to ask the question, why are you teaching this? What do you hope to do with that? What do you hope to accomplish? And a lot of times that needs to be clear before you do anything else. I think that's the most effective way. I agree.
And so that's interesting. You just said a lot of times that may need to be the first thing to do. I wonder, maybe you would, I'm just thinking out loud here, maybe we would encourage our students to do it, to kind of approach this project in that order, namely think about the context and sort of reconstruct that or construct that in your mind. And then before you get on to like all your fancy whiz-bang activities and whatever, maybe think, what am I actually trying to do here before you even get into the activities? I don't know. What do you think about that approach?
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a great place to start. And it's also, I think, a constant thing, even as you get into the actual developing and writing of the content of your lesson plan, to be asking that question throughout. Why am I having them read this passage? What's this going to accomplish in the big picture of what I want to do? So keep asking that question even throughout the whole project.
Yeah. Okay. Well, hopefully some students will take us up on that. And it may be, we often have teachers, as students here at Luther. So if they have other ideas, feel free to pass those on, and we can pass those ideas on to the rest of the class. And then we also ask the students to kind of think about some of the big ideas. That's the second component of the midterm, is what's the big thesis, that like the one sentence statement that you kind of want to instill in these students. So it's another kind of clarifying exercise. I actually think that's more for the teacher than it is for the students, because it kind of gives the teacher a little bit of a touchstone to say, this is what I'm going after. So where this can be helpful in my experience is If you're in a setting where you're teaching and it's live, not digital like this, then people will often want to ask all sorts of questions, which have absolutely no connection to the material at all. And if I have a thesis in mind, it helps me to prioritize how I'm going to address some of those questions. Because there's some questions that I can kind of do like the politician's move, where I can spin it my own and kind of bring it back to what I want to talk about. And then there are other questions where I might want to say, you know what, that is a really good question. Can we talk about that on the sideline afterward? And just having that thesis in mind at least helps me prioritize engagements like that. And then in the final thing, let's see, no, what do we ask you? Oh, the next thing is just to develop some learning activities in whatever way you think is going to be most effective. I mean, I don't, you know, Dr. Fever, I don't necessarily have like a one set way that I want to approach every topic. I like to mix things in a live setting, to mix things between a little bit of lecture and then a transition to maybe something that's discussion based, or at least requires more student engagement. But I don't know, do you have any other thoughts on the activity side?
Yeah, I don't know if I have any thoughts in addition to that, especially, you know, what kinds of activities would work. You know, I think there's a whole grab bag of possibilities, but I think mixing things up is certainly helpful. Even for, say, you imagine, I can't remember what the project is targeting if there's a certain age group, but, you know, even if you're doing a lesson plan for adults versus youth, learning some sort of activity, dialogue, something like that is always good and engaging.
Yeah, and actually, with regard to the intended audience, you actually, or the students actually get to choose that. So they have this congregation, and they can say, okay, I want to focus on the college students, or I want to focus on people 50 and above, whatever it might be. I don't know, you know, whatever group it is that you might choose, kind of depending on how that congregation organizes itself. So yeah, in any case, they can choose that. And then the final thing that we ask you to do is to think about to kind of do a personal reflection on that question about how did we get the Bible, and to think about it kind of theologically, and how the study of this topic and the creation of these lessons has affected their own sense of faith and identity. So that's really more of a personal reflection piece. Yeah. So maybe we can, do you have anything else to add about the midterm, or I was thinking otherwise we could kind of shift to the forum.
No, I don't have anything else to add. I think this is a kind of thing, though, you want to really work at in bits and pieces over the course of the next, I remember the due date, but you know, don't wait until the last week before you start working on this, because this is kind of project that's going to take some thinking, a little bit of writing, and then going back over it and things like that.
Yeah, it is. We'll just plug a little reminder. It is due on the 21st of October. So that's, what is it, the 3rd today? You have, is it the 3rd? I don't remember. So you have, what, 18 days and some change to get this finished up. And yeah, I would agree. Don't do this last minute at all to tell, unless you're a master teacher, right, and just can do this stuff in your sleep. We will be able to tell. So yeah, it's due at 10:21. The syllabus says at midnight. On the website, it only allows us to go up until like 11:55 p.m. So try and get it in before 5 minutes to midnight. If you happen to, you know, finish at 11:57, email it to us. But otherwise, get it in, you know, by 11:55 p.m. on 10/21. And you can upload that to the website. That upload apparatus is under exams and submissions.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's see. Well, did you want to start with any comments from the forums? Anything that you noticed that we should look at?
Why don't you go first, and I'm going to review some of my notes here really quick. So if you've got anything, go ahead.
Some small administrative comments. A number of you emailed us this week about word length issues, and in part that's because our TAs have been diligent to control those boundaries, and even some students who were kind of perpetual offenders were credit for their posts this week. Now, I want to remind you that we're very, very kind of, we insist that our TAs are diligent and disciplined about the word count thing, and that's in part because we want their job to feel manageable, and if we kind of continually allow people to go longer, it creates more work for the TAs who have very limited hours in this class. So please stick to those word limits. We will enforce them. They aren't negotiable. We give you 10 words over the max and 10 words under. So just make sure you're within those, and you'll be good. I have creativity that I saw in the post this week, where there were people kind of actually creating the dialogue with this young niece or young person about how do we get the Bible, and I thought it was kind of a nice setup for the midterm, actually, because it helps you kind of. It's easy within the seminary world to kind of enter into our own jargon, and we think, okay, we can assume such and such a thing or such and such knowledge. But when you're talking with like your niece or something, in most cases you can't assume what you've learned in seminary. So I appreciated especially the use of some of the images about what the Bible's like through in our weekly phone calls too. So I just appreciated some of the creativity and thought that went into the post this week.
Yeah, and I think this kind of assignment, on the surface could appear kind of a sort of assignment that maybe some people wouldn't take seriously. I know, like when I was in seminary, if I were given such an assignment to explain something to a 12-year-old, I'd be like, "Are you serious? I want to talk the real stuff here," and that's so wrong. That was, looking back, I think, man, that was because there's a quote that I heard another seminary professor share once, and I don't even remember who said it, but it stuck with me. And she said, if you can explain these theological things that we're learning, whether it's law, gospel, or how we got the Bible or whatever, if you can explain it coherently in language that makes sense to a confirmation student, then you can explain it to anyone. And that really has stuck with me. For better or worse, but this sort of assignment, even just as a mind game in the forum, is really good to do. To think, because you force yourself to put yourself in someone else's shoes that's different than you, and to try and think about, okay, how are they gonna? What's their world? And how is this going to make sense in their world and in their language? And I think that's the best thing that we can do. So it's a great assignment, and it was fun. Like Michael said, really fun to see some of the creativity, because that's exactly it. I think to preach the gospel, we have to be creative.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that is definitely true. And yeah, we might also say that if you're, this will be the sharper edge of your comment, if we're unable to explain what we're trying to say to somebody who is a 12-year-old or whatever the age might be, then it probably means we don't understand it. So that's maybe the sharper edge of that. It makes me think about a really interesting book that was published by a Lutheran theologian, a Lutheran ecumenical theologian, Robert Jensen, who wrote, it was his book that gave me the idea for this prompt. He wrote a book about his dialogues with his granddaughter, where she would ask basically questions like this, or she would just ask these theological questions coming from the mind of, I think she may have been 8 or 9, 10, I can't remember exactly, but he would record those and then he put them in this book. And this is a guy who, when I read, I've written on him before, and when I read him, he is not the clearest writer. Like, he really but he does a pretty good job of trying to say what he's trying to say to his granddaughter, and so it's a worthwhile exercise. I appreciated at least the vulnerability on his part to put those things out there.
Yeah, and you used a great word, dialogue, and it made me think of some of the posts that were more dialogical, and those really struck me as because as I read those, I thought, what would I do? I mean, I'd go into explaining mode, and so I just kind of like talk and say how they should how they can understand, you know, how the Bible is put together. But the dialogue, the dialogue side was really, I thought was really neat to see, because I think that's a way to connect with people of all ages. Is, you know, when we're explaining theological stuff, to get out of explaining mode and to get into dialogue mode. And so there's a back and forth as we're and we may be trying to explain something, you know, to communicate information, but to do it as a dialogue rather than a monologue, you know, it was really neat to see those that had that element to it.
Yeah, I do agree with that. And I think, you know, within a system like ours, an educational system, I actually think when we enter into explanation mode, that's sometimes a kind of cover for our insecurity around the question. Because it's risky to do the dialogue thing. Because when you do the dialogue thing, you can actually, it's easier to come to the point where you don't know.
Yeah.
To be brought to sort of your end. And that's terrifying for many people if your security is based, if your sort of sense of identity and security is based in what you know, or you know, being able to impress people or whatever. But so I think that I appreciated the dialogue too, because it helped me realize that when I fail to engage in the dialogue side, it's sometimes an indication that I am actually a little bit afraid of the topic. That's not for everyone, but that can be for me, for sure.
No, I think that resonates with me as well. I think that's absolutely true for my experience.
It's scary to ask people questions and ask what they really think.
Yeah, and then to frame or to shape again, if, say there's information we want them to understand, to shape it around the questions and their perception of things. That takes another level of mental capacity, you know, that it is easier just to say what you think, and it takes another level of mental capacity, but it's all the more enriching though too.
You know, I was thinking that as I've thought about this prompt now, I guess 3 or 4 times, and I was thinking I might lead with the question, why does that matter to you? Or tell me why you're interested in that question. And that could be another interesting way into it, to ask that of the niece, right? Tell me why this is an important question for you. And maybe she'll just say, I don't know, I was curious, which is totally fine. That's a legitimate response. But you just wonder, like, what are the series of events or things that brought her to the point where she felt like she was interested in actually raising this question? And that could just unveil some interesting stuff. I don't know.
Yeah.
But overall, I thought the post went well this week, and there was a lot of creativity there, and clearly, I think it was clear to me that people were assimilating kind of the informational side of things as well.
Yeah. And one thing I noticed too, one of the TAs, I don't remember which one, commented about the diverse use of analogies to communicate how the Bible was put together with different human writers and things like that. And I think that's really key, is to be able to use analogies to communicate some of these things that are really hard to understand. I think is really valuable.
That's exactly right, and that also came up in the calls too, in some of our weekly calls. Oh, it looks like you had to run off and do something. That's all right. This whole idea of illustrations, no, you're good, and analogies came up in the weekly phone calls too, and just people, and I think it's helpful to kind of offer analogies. Analogies are always yes and no, but if you can find one that's particularly helpful on the yes side, then all the more power to you. I mean, one can think about things like the scrapbook. I thought that was an interesting way of talking about the Bible. A scrapbook, where in the past, students have talked about a patchwork quilt, Bible as library, Bible as newspaper. The newspaper one is interesting. Maybe that's less accessible to the current generation, but that would be accessible if you were teaching people, I mean, even our age, right? And the people in their 30s. I think they at least know what a newspaper is. Even if they digitally, they can sort of imagine, oh, this is what it's like to hold one of these in their hands, and they recognize, okay, that column is written by such and such a person. There's editors that kind of organize things, so it can work.
Yeah.
Well, I didn't have any other comments about the forums in general. I thought things went well this week.
Yeah, I did too. I thought it was really fun to have the discussion in the other Hangouts, but also to read some of the forums.
Yeah. Oops. Well, good. Well, everyone, I think we're going to sign off now. If you have any questions about the midterm as that approaches, please let us know. All right, great. Have a good day. Thank you.